You have entered the Command Zone, your destination for all aspects of Elder Dragon Highlander. Enjoy your stay.
Hello, everybody. We have an exciting episode of the Command Zone podcast today. It's just me, just Rachel Weeks, here all by my lonesome in the studio. Today, we are talking about my 25 Commander decks. We're going on a little walk in the park through my many decks. I'm excited to share those with you. I refer to them on the podcast a lot, so I figured you might as well meet them. But first, if you hear any cards that you're excited about, if you want to build any of these decks, go to cardkingdom.com/command. It's a great way to pick up cards and support the show. Card Kingdom has a great inventory of cards, so you can always get the version and the quality that you are looking for, especially with so many new products coming out. Card Kingdom's giant inventory makes sure that your decks are up to date. Plus, when you buy a whole bunch of cards, they show up on your doorstep in one package. So it's Christmas. You get all the cards at once. I know when I'm building a deck, one of these many, I try and order as many as I can at one time so that when I get them in the mail, I can sleeve them all up and I can have the deck ready to play at my next game night. And Card Kingdom makes that possible. Again, go to cardkingdom.com/command. The other way you can support the show is by going to ultrapro.com/command. You can see a couple of the satin cubes here beside me. I love satin cubes to protect my decks, especially when I'm traveling, when we're going to Magic Cons, when I'm going to game nights. I like to go to restaurants and bars, and I want to make sure that my decks are sealed tight and super safe. And Ultra Pro has all of the high quality products to protect my cards, whether they're in the box or on the battlefield in a sleeve, in double sleeves. I trust Ultra Pro with my collection. I hope that you can trust them as well. Also, when you pick them up, you will support the show. Again, go to ultrapro.com/command. Plus, this is an exciting new announcement. We are sponsored by Archidekt. Archidekt is an awesome deck building website that has a ton of tools and resources for deck builders. They've got an insight card search. They've got high-tech statistics. They've got many different layouts to show how the cards are arranged so that when you are building, you know exactly how much ramp you have, how much draw, and you can build exactly in your process. I like these very advanced deck building sites because they make me a better deck builder, and they make it easier for me to see where my deck is after I've made changes. Make sure I'm not cutting too many lands. So looking forward to that partnership with Archidekt, and hope you get over there and check it out. Finally, the final way to support us is directly at patreon.com/command-zone. It's a great way to support the show and make sure that all of your money is going directly to us to make this show cooler and bigger for you guys. And we shout out one lucky patron every episode, and this episode is dedicated to Sean Logue. You rock, Sean. Thanks for supporting the show. All right, let's get into it. I've got 25 decks to get through, and I want to get through them fast. I did break down I didn't want to go through every single deck list. There's a lot of decks. It would be a very long episode, but I did pull out 4 cornerstone cards in every deck to show what the Dex 99 really looks like. These are cards that would never be cut from the list that really show how the deck works. And because I like building with weird cards, I pulled out one lucky weirdo to show off as well. Cards that you may not see in decks as often or have special tech with the commander. So we'll have 4 cornerstone cards and 1 weirdo. Plus, I'll be ranking my decks based on how likely it is that I play them long term. The real test of a deck is that it sticks around for years and years to come. And I build a lot of decks, and not all of them last longer than a year or a year and a half, depending on the staying power of the deck. So I have ranked them from F to S in terms of their ability to stick around, how much I'm playing them, if I think they're going to make it to 2024 or not. So yeah, you're going to meet a ton of decks. Let's get into it. All right, the first deck that I am talking about is Ratchet Field Medic. Ratchet is a mid-power eggs deck that uses a lot of cheap artifacts that sacrifice themselves and things that gain life to recur those eggs. So it draws a lot of cards, it gains a lot of life, and it uses life gain payoffs to build up a super wide board eventually. The cool thing about Ratchet is the curve is very, very low. It is a mono-color deck, which I love to build. You can see there's a ton of artifacts, a ton of creatures, and a ton of lands, and that's about it. Okay, we're going to get into the cornerstones of this deck, starting with Zurin Orb. Zurin Orb is great in this deck because it allows me to sacrifice artifact lands for life, so I can get landfall triggers repeatedly and get artifacts coming in and out of the battlefield. Plus, it's a life gain trigger every turn. Implement of Improvement is the best egg in the deck because it doesn't need to tap to sacrifice it. And when Ratchet recurs artifacts, it brings it back tapped. So you can sacrifice Implement of Improvement, gain 2 life, bring it back to the battlefield, draw a card when it goes to the graveyard, and then bring it back to the battlefield, and then sack it again next turn. As long as you've got white mana, you can keep drawing cards and gaining life with Implement of Improvement. Lochiel is a great card draw engine in this deck because a lot of the artifacts that I'm recurring are creatures, and I can make them enter the battlefield every turn, which means I'll keep drawing cards with Lochiel. And Crested Sunmare is one of the best life gain payoffs in the deck because every time I gain life, which is every turn in this deck, I make a 5/5 indestructible horse. And no Rachel deck is complete without a weirdo. And this is my favorite in the deck. It's Bottle Gnomes. Bottle Gnomes sacrifices itself to gain 3 life, which is enough to bring it back to the battlefield. So I can gain 3 life and sacrifice Bottle Gnomes and bring it back to the battlefield and draw a card with Lochiel and make a horse with the Sunmare and keep the train rolling. This deck takes a ton of game actions. Every single turn, I'm sacrificing a bauble and gaining life to bring back the bauble, to draw a card and gain 2 life, sacrifice the thing and bring it back. And you take all these game actions and basically at the end of the day, you draw like 3 cards and gain 6 life. It's a lot of game actions. It attracts a ton of attention and the payoff is fairly small. So unfortunately, while Ratchet has been fun to play and fun to build, I don't think it has the staying power of my normal decks. I think I'm going to have to give this one an F. My next deck is Katilda Dawnhart Prime. This is a low power humans build with a ton of creatures. Clearly, there's 41 in the deck, most of them under 3 CMC. And they're all humans because Katilda can let them tap for mana. And hopefully I'll be using them to cast some of these high CMC creatures. So Kogla, Kamal, Torsten. You can see in the deck stats down here that the curve is relatively low, peaking at 3, which is where a lot of the best humans live. The deck is dominantly white because it is focused on recursion. It's not a perfect humans build. There's not a ton of synergy between the humans because I didn't really want to do it that way. The humans I liked are just sort of good. So it turned into a bit of a good stuff deck. But let's get into some of the cornerstones. In addition to making humans tap for mana, Katilda also puts +1 counters on all your creatures. And Abzan Falconer turns those counters into flying, which gives you a little bit of power that this deck needs. Sometimes it's hard to break through. Call the Coppercoats lets you go wide and make a ton of mana because it makes a ton of humans. And I really like Midnight Guard in this deck because whenever another creature enters the battlefield, it untaps, so it makes even more mana. One of the best mana sinks in the deck is Tireless Tracker, maybe one of the best humans ever. But this deck really takes advantage of those clues to start drawing cards. And honestly, the deck needs all of the mana sinks it can get. The weirdo in this deck is Planar Guide. This is a 1 mana human cleric, so it taps for mana, which is great, but also it has an activated ability that removes all creatures from the game and brings them all back at the end of turn. So it basically blinks the whole board slowly. It's great board protection. It's sort of a strange fog. I really like it if there's a board wipe. You can protect all of your stuff with this silly little human. I think this deck could use a little bit of an overhaul, honestly. There's not a ton of synergy between what's going on, and it has recursion that I like, but there's not a lot of sinks for this mana. So I think if Katilda's really going to go the distance, it's going to need a pretty serious rebuild. But where it lives today, it's probably an E. My next deck is a mid-power storm deck helmed by Krark and Tana. They are a goofy little combo, but I wanted a Gruul deck and I don't play a lot of Stompy, so I decided to build my own Stompy using pump spells and doubling them with Krark and making Tana really big to make a ton of saprolings. So let's get into it. This deck has a few creatures, most of them payoffs for spells or token decks. You can notice a 24 instants and 10 sorceries. Many of these are pump spells just to make Tana bigger. There are a lot of them to draw cards, a lot of protection because this is a fairly glass cannon plan. You can see that my curve is quite low, a lot of 1-drops, a lot of 2-drops, and the deck is predominantly red because it is more of a Spellslinger deck rather than a green Stompy deck. Now let's get into our cornerstone cards. The first one is Season of Growth. This is an enchantment that has an ability that scries, but largely this says whenever you cast a spell that targets a creature you control, draw a card. So it turns all of our pump spells into card draw. The next one is Wild Defiance, which is very similar, but instead of card draw, it makes them even bigger. This turns Tana into a huge menace and makes a ton of saprolings. It also just makes all of my pump spells a little bit more efficient. The nice thing about this is it becomes the target. So when a spell is copied with Krark, it makes it twice as big. You don't have to cast. The next cornerstone card is Helena and Elena Partners. This card is great in the deck because I can turn all of the targeted spells, and instead of pointing them at Tana, I can point them at Helena and Elena, which converts pump spells into counters. And all of those counters can get loaded up on Tana. She can get haste and stay big for the next turn. The final card in this deck, of course, it's a cornerstone. It's Zada, Hedron Grinder. Any deck that uses pump spells, especially cantripping pump spells, and makes a ton of tokens, wants a Zada in it. And this deck takes full advantage. The weirdo in this deck is Wart the Raid Mother, a classic Gruul Spellslinger list that makes tokens when she enters the battlefield and then gives your instants and sorceries Conspire, which means you can turn all of those saprolings you're making into even more copies of your pump spells. She's great, but a little bit win more in this deck. As much as I love Krark and Tana, this is a very glass cannon deck that can be very explosive. So it's sort of too powerful for casual tables and not powerful enough for decks with a lot of interaction. So I don't get to play it as much as I want. I think this deck is sort of doomed. It's possible I turn it into a Blanca deck at some point, but for now it's an E. My next deck is Rograkh and Akroma. If this looks familiar, it is because I played it on game nights. This was my very first deck that I built for game nights, and it entered my collection. But let's get into this deck. So this is a keyword deck that has a stack of creatures that come with a ton of keywords. It's classic sort of Boros aggro. The curve is a little bit higher than the deck like this often wants to be. You can see how many 4 and 5 drops are in the deck. Again, predominantly white. I'm largely a white player, so you can see really where my biases lie when I am deck building. But let's get into the cornerstones of this deck. The first cornerstone in this deck is Commander's Insignia. This card is great in any aggressive deck, but especially one with partners, because creatures get +1/+1 for each time you cast a commander from the command zone. A cornerstone in any keywords deck, Odric Lunarch Marshal has to be here. It just means if one thing has a keyword, they all have the keywords. The next card may look a little weird, but I think Skyfire Phoenix is actually underrated. It's a Phoenix that whenever it's in your graveyard, if you cast your commander, it's back on the battlefield. And it's a 3/3 with flying and haste. It's great for keyword decks. It's great with partners decks. This bird cannot be kept down. And the final card, of course, is Aurelia, the War Leader. It's a Boros aggro deck. You've gotta have her. Plus, she's loaded up with keywords. The weirdo in this deck is Power Matrix. It's sort of an old school equipment. It's an artifact that taps to give one creature +1/+1, flying, first strike, and trample. Some of the best keywords in the game, and it's free to do every single turn. Ton of fun, and I refuse to cut it. I have a foil one. So this deck has a lot of nostalgia for me. It's my first deck on game nights. It's a ton of fun to play, but it is sort of just a basic Boros deck, and I don't find myself reaching for it very often anymore. So as much as I love it and it has a special place in my heart, I wonder if maybe it's time to take this deck apart. I'm going to give it a D because I don't want to take it apart, but I don't play it as much as I used to. All right, my next deck is Temmet, Vizier of Naktamun. Temmet is a goofy equipment deck that is themed around living weapons. This deck started as sort of a jokey germ tribal deck, and it's turned into actually a fairly interesting equipment deck because it doesn't need as many creatures as a lot of equipment decks would need. It's really high in the artifact category and a little bit lower on creatures, only 17, which, believe it or not, is fairly low for me. The curve in this deck is a little bit higher than you want in an aggro deck, but because it's got some goofy value pieces, it's fine. It's fine. Let's get into the cornerstones. The first cornerstone of this deck is the same as any equipment deck. If you want to spend the money, it's a Stoneforge Mystic. Living weapon cards are very expensive, so I like the tutor part of this Stoneforge Mystic, but it's largely to cheat things into play. And speaking of cheating things into play, the next cornerstone card is Armored Sky Hunter. This card is awesome in equipment decks, but particularly ones that have expensive equipment cards or expensive auras and want them on the battlefield right away. So this is one of my favorite cards in the deck, turned into a real powerhouse. Next one is a little bit weird. It's Mirror Weave. And it's the reason that this deck is in white and blue. Mirror Weave says that everything becomes a copy of a target non-legendary creature, which in this deck is a germ. So it's a one-sided board wipe, basically. Like, you'll take out some of your value pieces, but you can turn all of your opponent's stuff into 0/0s and keep your equipped creatures. I like Mirror Weave a lot. I think it's some of the coolest. It's the coolest card in the deck for sure. And of course, Batterskull. If you're playing a living weapon deck, you are built around this card. It's so powerful. It's such a huge beater, and Temmet can make it unblockable. So it's this great defensive piece and this huge aggressive piece. I got a fancy one because I had to have it. And the weirdo from this deck is one of the more recent weirdos. It's Vulpine Harvester. And the reason this is the weirdo is because it kind of took me by surprise. It says whenever one or more Phyrexians you control attack, return target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield if its mana value is less than or equal to their total power. This is a Phyrexian Germ Voltron deck. Germs are Phyrexians. When you attack, you can reanimate a huge artifact. I didn't think about it until I was going through some of the singles that I had opened and was like, this card's so good in the Germ deck. And it honestly sort of relit something in me about this deck. Got me excited about it again. So I was excited to add this new little fox in there. So this deck, as I said, sort of started as a joke. It's very, very low power. It plays some very, very bad cards. And as a result, I don't get to play it as much as I want, which is unfortunate because I do think it's a special equipment build. It is very unique. And, but still, I don't reach for it that often. I find it a little bit linear. It's Voltron, but it not with your commander, which makes it significantly worse. So I don't get to play it as much as I want. But honestly, some of the new upgrades from March of the Machine will keep this deck around a little bit longer. As a result, I think this deck gets a D. My next deck is Aeve, Progenitor Ooze. This is a high-powered storm deck that makes token copies of my commander, which I got the coolest little tokens for them. These are done by Tim Taranto, who makes amazing art and great tokens. Aeve is a very powerful, fun, big mana storm deck with a focus on creatures. It uses Aeve's high devotion and the devotion of all of Aeve's copies to make a ton of mana with Nykthos Shrine to Nyx and various other mana sources and untapping it and keep going and more. It looks sort of like an elf ball deck, and you can see how low the curve is. A lot of 1-drops, a lot of 2-drops, and then some higher payoffs here. The deck is predominantly creatures, which you can see here. Look at that. 39 creatures, 39 lands. It sounds about right for a Rachel deck. If it has this like cool rock on sign, that means I built it. It's got a ton of cool cards in it, but let's get into the cornerstones. This deck is built all around Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, especially with the 3 green pips in Eve. That means if I have like 2 or 3 copies of Eve, this taps for 9 mana and I don't have to control anything else. But in this deck, it is usually going to make 30 mana, and then I have lots of untappers like this next cornerstone card. This Malachite Talisman is a very bad infinite combo enabler that allows me to untap target permanent. So it's perfect because it can untap Nykthos and it can untap Karametra's Acolyte. The next one is one of the best card draw engines in the deck. It's Augur of Autumn. It's predominantly a creature and land deck, so this card can keep you churning through your deck and using all of that 30, 60, 120 mana that you've made. The final and best mana sink in the deck, as it always is Temur Sabertooth. Yes, this is a Temur Sabertooth combo deck that bounces cards that draw cards and cards that untap things and acidic slimes to blow up all of your lands. It's a very powerful mana sink, but usually I use it to draw through my deck until I can find a big payoff. And the weirdo of the deck is Gaia's Touch. This is an enchantment for green that lets you play an additional land as long as that land is a forest, which in this deck it is. It also sacrifices to add 2 green to your mana pool. So in a storm deck like Eve, this is a mana neutral ramp spell that just puts a land into play. A lot of the time it's kind of like an exploration that doesn't draw you a card, but it's free, so it's very good. Also, it adds 2 green to my devotion if I'm in that place in the game. Overall, Eve is a super fun, super powerful deck, but there aren't a lot of tables that I sit down at that are prepared to play against a mono green storm deck. Turns can get very long and it can win very fast, very consistently. So it's just not appropriate for a lot of the games I play in. Again, I love playing it, but I don't get to do it that often. As a result, it just kind of gathers dust in my collection. So I love Eve, but it's still a C because I don't get to play her very often. My next deck is a Jeskai deck with Dynahair in the command zone and the companion Zirda. This deck is an artifact and artificer and wizard deck that is sort of built around baubles and wizards and artificers. So you'll see a lot of them here. It's worth noting that I don't activate Dynahair all that often. She's largely here to give all of these creatures with activated abilities haste. But sometimes, you can activate it. There are abilities in here that cost more than 4 mana. And yes, Zirda is a little bit of a nombo with Dynahair, but they're good with some of the same cards. So here they live together in harmony. Again, this deck is predominantly white, with about half the deck being red and blue. It's an artifact and creature deck. Still more creatures than artifacts. It's who I am. So this deck has a ton of different ways to tap and untap your stuff because that's what Dynahair really wants. But let's get into these cornerstones so you can get to know the deck. This first cornerstone card is Fate Stitcher. It's the best tap and untapper in the game, and it can do it from the graveyard or the battlefield. Any untapped deck wouldn't be complete without it. It's an artifact deck and an artificer deck, so it's perfect for Osgir the Reconstructor. I also love Osgir with Dynahair because you can copy the ability, which means that you can make 4 tokens that are copies as long as you're exiling something that's 2 CMC or higher. Plus, a sack outlet comes in handy all the time when you're playing an artifact deck. The next one is Wand of Wonder. Wand of Wonder is just a very fun card to have in play. Especially with Dynahair when you get to copy it, because you can cast 3 to 4 spells with it most of the time, and they're all completely free. So I love Wand of Wonder as an interaction piece and also like a wand in this Artificer and Wizard deck. The final cornerstone in this deck is a win con and a big old goofball. It's Bosch, Iron Golem. So you can copy up this activated ability. Again, with Dynahair, what I like to throw most with Bosch is the Angel Bus. I have taken people out that way, and it's the funniest way a person can die, for sure. The weirdo in this deck is Viashino Heretic. It doesn't exactly synergize with my artifacts. It's just nice that it has haste. So I love it in this deck. It can do a ton of damage and a lot of removal depending on who you're playing against. And I just can't bear to cut the little guy. Look at him. Dynaheir Inzerta is a super fun deck, and it's got a lot of different ways that it wins the game. It's got a lot of different powerful cards that don't necessarily synergize with each other, and it's pretty fun to play, but it's also very dirtily, and I can be in very commanding positions and still not have a way to close out the game. So I can find it frustrating to play sometimes. I will probably try and do a little bit of a rebuild on this deck, but as is, it's fun, but it's a C. I don't think it'll go the distance. All right, the next deck is Kumena. This is a low power merfolk build, as you know, many merfolk builds are. It uses a lot of low CMC merfolk to draw cards with Kumena most of the game. It has a lot of ways to untap merfolk, so you can keep drawing more cards, and then eventually it lands enough lords to win the game, hypothetically. This is a largely blue deck, as you would expect from a merfolk deck. You can see that there's a lot of green mana actually in this deck. And it's because a lot of the ramp cards are green, and I want to make sure that I have a green source early. Again, rock-on symbol, mostly creatures, mostly lands, with a fairly low curve, living mostly in the 2-drop and 3-drop slot. Let's get into those cornerstone cards. The cornerstone of any merfolk deck, it's Lord of Atlantis. This is exactly the kind of card that I want on the board. I want a ton of them, and I want all of my merfolk to be as big as possible and largely unblockable. So super glad anytime I have Lord of Atlantis in hand. The next one is Marrow Commerce. This is perfect because I can tap all of my merfolk on my turn to draw cards or put counters on stuff and then untap them, so I have a solid defense. The neat thing about Marrow Commerce is I can actually tap it with Kumena's ability because it is a merfolk. The next one is a great payoff in the deck. It's Throne of the God Pharaoh, which deals damage equal to the number of tapped creatures I control. With a tap outlet, Throne of the God Pharaoh is easy to make happen, and I've got lots of untappers, so I don't have my defenses down when I have it in play. The final cornerstone card is a new merfolk card. It's Emperor Mihail II. This lets me cast merfolk spells off the top of my library, which is a great source of card advantage. But more importantly, actually, it makes merfolk tokens. This deck really wants to go wide, and whenever I have to commit a non-token merfolk to the board, I tend to get blown out. So the more tokens I can make, the better. And Emperor Mihail is one of the best ways to do that. The weirdo in this deck is a real goofball. It's Political Trickery. It's a sorcery that basically swaps a land I control with a land an opponent controls, which is cool. I could get their sweet land, but largely it's to give an opponent who doesn't have islands an island. It turns on my island walk and also, probably steals a bounce land or something like that. So I love merfolk and I love the way that they work together, but I really like merfolk because they're a tricksy group, like they're a tricksy kind of deck, and Kumena isn't that way. It really wants to commit to the board. It actually tends to be fairly sorcery speed. So I think I like a merfolk deck, but I don't know if Kumena is exactly the commander for me. I'm really holding out for another merfolk commander coming out in Ixalan, maybe. I don't know. I'm hopeful. But until then, this deck is cool, but not quite the merfolk deck I know it could be. So I'm going to give it a C. My next deck is a mid-power lands deck, but more specifically a deserts deck. This is Hazizon, Shaper of Sand. So this is a landfall deck, but it really wants to make specific lands enter the battlefield over and over again. And because of that, it has a lot more tutors than I would normally put into a lands deck because I'm looking for those deserts. The mana base is a little bit dodgy because deserts tend to be one color or colorless. And that's why I have this huge dedication to green in the deck is to finding them. The curve is pretty normal, high in the 2 spot because that ramp is so important, and I need to get my commander down in 3. Let's get into the cornerstones to get to know the deck. The first cornerstone is an incredible overrun. It's Jetmir, Nexus of Revels. Hazizon can go wide really fast, so having 10 creatures or 9 or more creatures is so easy for this deck. The problem is if Jetmir gets removed, then it all falls apart. The next card is the reason for the season. Nahiri's Lithoforming has been one of my favorite cards for a long time, and this card is great in this deck because Hazizon lets you play deserts from the graveyard. So if you sack deserts, you can draw that many cards, and you get that many additional land drops to replay all the deserts you just sacked. Really powerful, really neat card, and I'm glad I get to play it. The next one is Realms Uncharted, the best lands tutor in the deck for sure, because Hazizon lets you play deserts from the graveyard. So if they go to your hand, great. If they go to the graveyard, great. You found 4 of your deserts. The final one is the best piece of card draw in the deck. It's Rite of Harmony. Anytime a Sand Warrior or any creature enters the battlefield, you draw a card. And you can do that on 2 different turns because it has flashback. This card is so powerful and exactly what the deck needs because it tends to dump its hand fairly quickly. The weirdo in this deck is Ruin Ghost. It basically lets you blink a land. And it does it for so cheap. It's hard to get deserts into play multiple times in a turn, and Ruin Ghost is a great option for that, without sacking your lands, of course. Hazizon is a sweet deck, and I really like that it's a lands deck with a twist. It's not as easy as just getting a land into play. You have to get a desert into play. So it's been a great home for some of my expensive lands staples, but it is still quite high power. It wins with Perforos or big overruns, and it isn't at home at a lot of tables. So I like playing it. I like having it right now, but again, a little bit too powerful for the games that I am most often playing. So C for Hazizon. My next deck is Tayam. Tayam, the Luminous Enigma. This is a saga deck, and it uses decks that want to add or take away counters like Tayam to reuse saga abilities or to reuse creature abilities. And it's kind of like a grindy Enchantress deck. You can see it's still a Rachel deck. It's got 23 creatures, 27 enchantments. And a lot of those are just things that put counters on creatures. So Tayam can remove counters and keep recurring stuff from the graveyard. This is largely a green deck, surprisingly, because a lot of the good enchantresses are green. Again, the curve's still high in 2s and 3s, which is pretty normal for my decks. But let's get into those cornerstones. The first cornerstone card is Archon of Sun's Grace. In this deck, constellation triggers are way better than cast triggers because Tayam makes them enter the battlefield but doesn't necessarily let you cast enchantments. So as many constellation triggers as possible. And this one's one of the best. It makes 2/2 flying creatures. Beastmaster Ascension is a 3-mana powerful enchantment, so Tayam can recur it from the graveyard, and it can turn all those tokens that I'm making into big flying threats. The next card is the reason for the deck. It's Scholar of New Horizons. I can tap it and remove a counter from any kind of permanent to go find a Plains card. So this is perfect with my sagas because I can keep removing lore counters and keep triggering them. A sample saga is the first Eroan Games. It's perfect in this deck because it makes a token, it puts 3 counters on something, which is perfect for Tayam, and then it draws cards. It's exactly the kind of saga that you want because it's also 3 CMC or under, so Tayam can recur it from the graveyard. The weirdo in this deck is Hunting Grounds. It's a little enchantment that lets me cheat creatures into play. And no, I don't have huge expensive creatures to cheat into play, but it's a green-white enchantment deck that works out of the graveyard so it can make Threshold happen. It's too fun. I can't cut it. I won't cut it. Don't make me cut it. So I've really struggled to build Enchantress, and I've also struggled with Abzan because both tend to be very powerful and sort of tend to build themselves. And I actually really like the solution that I've landed on with Tayam, but the deck is a little dirtily and can be kind of overwhelming to play. So I think we're not quite done with the iteration of this deck, but it's close. I can feel it. This deck is a C. The next one is Eloise, Nephalia Sleuth. This is a mid-power tchotchke deck that wants to make a ton of artifacts just a lot of them and sacrifice them for value. It is a murder mystery themed deck. I like a lot of investigators. I like a lot of spies, magnifying glasses, murder. I really wanted this deck to feel like very mysterious and feel very Innistrad. So I kept it a little bit more themed to keep the power down, but it's still a very effective deck. It's largely black, as you can see. Creatures, artifacts, lands. There's gonna be a lot of creatures. There just is. There's no deck that isn't, and I'm learning this about myself. 22 creatures in this artifact deck. Let's get into some of the cornerstones. The first cornerstone of the deck is a murder weapon. It's a ceremonial knife. This is a really great equipment because it makes a blood token whenever this creature deals combat damage, whether it blocks, whether it hits, as long as this creature does combat damage, you're making a blood, which is perfect for Eloise because she wants as many artifact tokens as possible. The next one is hard evidence. Perfectly on theme, plus it makes 2 tokens to sacrifice and trigger Eloise. The next one is murder. Yes, it's overcosted, and yes, it's still in the deck because it's a murder mystery deck, and that's how it works. The next one is a spy, a sanguine spy. In fact, it has a sack outlet that lets you surveil, and then it also draws cards if there's a bunch of stuff in the graveyard, which there often is because of Eloise. So I love these cards because of flavor. I love that they work together mechanically. It gives the deck like a very specific feeling. All right, Eloise's weirdo is Thran Turbine. This is a little 1-mana artifact that makes 2 colorless mana in your upkeep, which is perfect for cracking clues. I love it. It's a free clue on your turn, and it's a very cool card that I wish sees a little bit more play. Eloise has crawled her way back from the brink a couple of times. I almost took it apart a few times. It was too low power, and then it didn't feel themed enough, and I think I've gotten it to a place that I really like playing this deck. So I think that Eloise has settled at a B. My next deck is Kethek. There's some kind of engine. Crucible Goliath. Kethek is a low-power sacrifice deck that focuses on looping non-token creatures in and out of the graveyard. So there's a lot of dies triggers. There's a lot of creatures that bring themselves back to the battlefield. There's a lot of recursion. You can see all these reanimation pieces for when I sack them to Kethek. This deck is largely black. And the curve is kind of all over the place because the way that Kethek works is it cascades into creatures. So I wanted creatures at all types. And it does swing a little bit high because I picked some creatures that have higher CMC so they can cheat smaller ones into play. Doesn't work particularly well, but it can work. All right, let's check out the cornerstones. The first cornerstone of the deck is a brand new card. It's Archpriest of Shadows. I am very high on this card. It is the one with backup that reanimates a creature. It's hard to get a creature that reanimates that doesn't have a ton of downsides. Getting combat damage obviously is tricky, but with Death Touch, it's a lot easier. Another cornerstone in this deck is a huge source of card draw. It's Doom Weaver. This card rules. If you are sacrificing big creatures, especially if you are recurring them, you can draw 4 cards, 5 cards, 6 cards at a time. And it's also a huge blocker. So I like Doomweaver a lot. The win con in this deck is primarily damage when cards come in and out of the graveyard. So Flayer of the Hatebound is probably the best one. But also Seize the Spotlight is an important part of this deck. The deck has a couple of threaten effects that can steal creatures, so you can sacrifice them to Kethek. And this one is often just nobody gives me their creatures and I draw 3 cards and make 3 treasures, which is really strong. The weirdo in this deck is just another piece of recursion. It's Body Snatcher. When Body Snatcher enters the battlefield, you have to discard a card, and when it dies, you reanimate a creature. So it could be the card you discarded or something else. It's not very good, but it is super cool, and I like it a lot in a deck that has a sack outlet in the command zone. So Kethek really surprised me. I have always really liked my friend Mike Carrozza's Lizold deck, which sacrifices non-token creatures and loops them in and out of the battlefield. And I really wanted to build something similar. And Kethek felt open-ended enough and was a sack outlet that kept drawing more creatures out of my deck, so it felt close. And it's been a ton of fun because it gives you new pieces to figure out how to win with every single turn. I may try a few versions of this with the new Ayara in the command zone, but for now, it's still a B. My next deck is a low-power Voltron deck with Lord of Tressorhorn at the helm. He is an old doofus that is a 4-mana 10-4 that has a lot of downsides when he enters the battlefield. As a result, a lot of this deck is fodder just to get Tressorhorn into play. The rest is dedicated to keeping cards in my hand and also pumping him up so he can deal 21 damage to my opponents. It's a pretty well-balanced deck. It kind of looks like a Grixis Good Stuff deck with some small creatures in it, but it's got some weird corner cases. So let's look at these cornerstones. The first cornerstone in this deck, as is in many Voltron decks, is Bolt Bend. You spend a lot of resources getting Tressorhorn into play. You have to protect him once he's on the battlefield. He's got an ability that'll regenerate him, but for swords and paths and all kinds of -1/-1 abilities, Bolt Bend comes in handy. The next one is a little strange. It's Exalted Flamer of Tzeentch. This says at the beginning of your upkeep, you return a random instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. And then when you cast instants or sorceries, it deals damage. But largely, this is just to keep cards in your hand. It keeps giving you back those little value cantrips in the deck. It keeps giving you back the pump spells. I really like this card in the deck, even though it looks a little strange. The best card in this deck by far is Obeka Brute Chronologist. This card lets you counter the ETB on Lord of Tressorhorn, which is huge. It means you don't have to sack 2 creatures. It means you don't have to have an opponent draw 2 cards. It's so efficient, and it just lets you have a 10-4. It's great. The next one is Uncaged Fury, which is the perfect combat trick in this deck. It gives target creature +1/+1 and double strike, which is enough for Lord of Tressorhorn to do 21 damage. 22 damage, I guess. The weirdo in this deck is Sinister Concierge. This card, when it dies, exiles it and another creature for 3 turns. It puts them on suspend. So if I cast this on turn 2 and I cast Tressorhorn, I can exile an opponent's creature for like 3 turns, and then Sinister Concierge comes back in case I lose Lord of Tressorhorn and need another thing to sacrifice. This card has been a house, and it's really sweet. Tressorhorn is a weird little deck. When you look at the list, you're like, I'm not really sure exactly what we're doing. And that's cool to me. It has a lot of Rakdos cards in it that I just wanted to put into a deck. And it was fun building around this big goofball. And honestly, I've fallen in love with the deck. I kind of like that it's illegible. I kind of like that you look at it and go, what is this pile? So I think today, Lord of Tressorhorn is a B. My next deck is by far my dumbest deck. It's Norin the Wary. Stickers. Mono red stickers is a very difficult thing to pull off, and getting a sticker onto Norin is also difficult to pull off. So there's a lot that goes into this deck to getting a sticker onto a man that's afraid of everything. There's a lot of things like Kiki Chiki or Splinter Twin that make copies of creatures that enter the battlefield and put stickers on stuff. And that's how you get stickers onto Norin without scaring him away. Other than that, it's a typical ramp and card draw plus all of the sticker cards I could possibly get in mono red. But let's go into the cornerstones to get to know the deck. The best sticker card in mono red is Minotaur de Force. It is an ETB, you get a Tix, and then you put a sticker on a permanent. This is a great card to start making copies of, so you can get more Tix, so you can get a cool ability sticker onto Norin. The next one is Rose Room Treasurer, which is great in any Norin deck. You make treasure tokens every single turn that Norin enters. So usually 4 treasures around. The next one is Warstorm Surge, which doesn't seem that impressive when Norin is a 2/1, but you can get a sticker on Norin that turns him into a 7/2 or a 10/3 and even bigger, and then you have a 10/3 entering the battlefield each turn. It's slow, but a very funny clock. The other best way to get stickers onto Norin is Wicker Picker. It gives creature spells you cast Sticker Kicker, which means that when you cast the spell, you pay an extra 1 and it can enter with a sticker on it. Now you're like, how do we even cast Norin? Norin comes down on 1 and you don't have enough ticks to get the stickers onto him. I understand. That's why this deck runs Sanctum of Eternity. The weirdo of this deck is Sanctum of Eternity, which is for returning Norin to your hand so you can cast him with Sticker Kicker to put a sticker on him. It is hard to make this deck happen, but when you do, it's funny enough that it's worth it. Honestly, joke decks don't tend to last a long time because they are hard. They're not as good. It's hard to find spots for them, but this deck is so funny to me and I'm still having a ton of fun with it. So Norin gets a B from me. Okay, we've got lots more exciting decks to go, but first, a few words from our sponsors.
Hey everyone, we are super excited to announce that we are now sponsored by Archidekt.
Archidekt is the perfect place to build and store decks online, whether you want to build from scratch or catalog your collection.
Everything is easy and intuitive. It's got the same feeling as when you sit at the table with your cards laid out right in front of you.
Then, once your deck is done and ready to go, their built-in playtester is a great tool to make sure your brews work as intended.
And now that Archidekt has partnered with EDH Rec, they have all the resources and data they need to really refine and perfect the platform. So even if you've tried Archidekt in the past, it's definitely worth taking a new look right now.
Just go to archidekt.com and start brewing on the best deck builder out there.
That's ARCHIDEKT.com. All right, I'm gonna cast Rampant Growth. Chauffeur?
Yes, sir.
Find a forest for me, please.
Of course, sir.
Okay, wait, what is happening here?
Isn't it great? I got the idea from Indeed.
The hiring website?
Yeah, when you sponsor a job post on Indeed, they do all the searching for you. Just like you don't want to waste time looking through your library, you don't want to waste hours browsing multiple job sites. But with Indeed, you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Indeed's powerful hiring platform gives you a short list of candidates whose resumes match your job description the moment you sponsor a post. It's like hiring at flash speed. Plus, according to US Indeed data, candidates you invite to apply are 3 times more likely to do so than someone who just sees it in a search.
Your forest, sir.
Oh, thank you.
Jordan, if he's making you do this against your will, you can tell us.
I just like the word chauffeur.
Okay, you do you.
Start hiring now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/CommandZone. Offer good for a limited time. Claim your $75 credit now at Indeed.com/CommandZone. Again, Indeed.com/CommandZone. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Hail! I am Sakashima of 1,000 Faces, the cloning connoisseur. When you copy a creature, you can get major discounts on a massive 8-drop. But these days, the true master of discount duplicates is RAYCON wireless earbuds. So many audio products overcharge for their fancy name brands, but RAYCON offers an affordable clone with the very same top-tier sound. And their earbuds come with many rogue-friendly features. Awareness mode helps me stay vigilant, while the simple tap functions give me instant speed control. And with inflation breathing down my 1,000 necks, RAYCONs were the ideal purchase. They even offer free returns and buy now, pay later options. So it's no wonder they have over 50,000 5-star reviews. Of course, my favorite thing about RAYCONs is using them to make my clone calls.
Hello, this is actual coma, not a clone. I'd like to order 1,000 anchovy pizzas, please.
Priceless.
Go to buyraycon.com/command today to get 15% off your Raycon order. That's buyraycon.com/command to score 15% off. Again, buyraycon.com/command.
Whether you're searching for the latest sneaker drop, that iconic handbag, a timeless watch, or your next piece of classic jewelry, eBay authenticators are there verifying every detail of your purchase.
Yep, we're talking each inch, stitch, tick, facet, and clasp that make the piece you're searching for worthy of your collection.
eBay's authenticators are experts in their craft, true connoisseurs.
And as leaders in their fields, they're making sure your items always arrive as authentic as your style. So go ahead, get that piece you've always wanted.
And leave it up to the meticulous eyes of an eBay authenticator to make sure that watch movement is original, that glimmer is real gold, that rare sneaker is legit, or that handbag is really made of genuine leather, and never get faked over again.
In a world full of fakes, it's time to get real with eBay Authenticity Guarantee.
Everyone deserves real. Visit ebay.com for terms.
Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. We are going to get back into it because we have quite a few more decks to go, starting with Lord Windgrace, a high-powered Jund Super Friends deck. You can see there's 20 Planeswalkers in this deck, 19 creatures still, can't give them up. It uses Jund's sort of raw ramp and draw power to get all of these expensive Planeswalkers into play and just sort of overpower the table. It's still largely a green deck because it is lands focused. It does a lot of ramping and it uses a couple of tools specifically with Planeswalkers. So let's get into these cornerstones. All right, the first cornerstone in this deck is Field of the Dead. In a lands deck, it's one of the most powerful cards all the time, but it's a great defensive piece for your Planeswalkers. If you have a Field of the Dead and 3 Planeswalkers, your opponents are going to have a very tough time getting at your Planeswalkers. So this card is great. The next one is the most powerful card in the deck by far. It's Evolution Sage. It's whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, proliferate. This is the reason that Windgrace is a Super Friends commander, is you can have Evolution Sage, you can make a bunch of lands enter the battlefield, and you can soup up all of your Planeswalkers. I also don't run Doubling Season, so Evolution Sage is sort of my way of ulting Planeswalkers without running stuff that just makes them come in with twice as many counters. Next is Kart the Lion. Similarly, it just makes your Planeswalkers so powerful, and it allows me to add red. So I didn't really want Kurth in the command zone because I wanted to be able to use powerful red Planeswalkers like Chandra, Awakened Inferno. This is one of the biggest win cons in the deck, is just sort of grinding your opponents out with these emblems. You can load them up with 3-4 emblems, and this deck is good at defense, so it can protect her as long as possible, as long as you need to really chip away at your opponent's life total. So this isn't a super weird deck. A lot of the cards in it are just very powerful, but a lot of people question why Kura the Boundless Sky is there. And he's a flyer with Death Touch that has a great dies ability. If Kura is protecting my Planeswalkers, nobody's coming for them. He's so powerful, and I really like having these good rattlesnakes to keep people away from my Planeswalkers. So I love playing this deck. It's a fair, powerful, efficient deck that just runs good cards, and it really can make you figure out how to win the game using whatever powerful tools you have in front of you. It's not a linear win all the time. So I love playing Windgrace. I think he's going to stick around. He's one of my first decks, and this is a build that I've been really happy with. We'll give Windgrace an A. The next deck is my beloved Dragon's Approach deck with Galazeth Prismari in the command zone. This is a stormy, burny spellslinger deck that is just here to do damage and get dragons into play. It is full of big dragons and ways to cast more and more Dragon's Approaches. You will note that it is extremely red and extremely 3, which is the column of Dragon's Approaches. You can see that this deck is largely lands and sorceries. I run 25 copies of Dragon's Approach in this deck, so it's definitely a cornerstone, but let's look at the others. This first cornerstone card is Locket of Yesterdays. It lets spells I play cost 1 less to play for each card with the same name as that spell in your graveyard. So it makes Dragon's Approaches cost red, basically. Plus, it taps for mana because of my commander. And, of course, the next cornerstone card is Dragon's Approach. There's 25 of them. We're going to cast a lot of them. Next is Trail of Evidence, which is so powerful with Galazeth. Every time I cast a Dragon's Approach, I make a new clue, which taps for mana and can also draw cards. It's very good. The next one is the first dragon I search for every single time I get to tutor a dragon onto the battlefield. It's Nullspine Dragon. So I can discard my hand and draw cards equal to the amount of damage I've dealt to a target player. It just, when I've committed all my resources to the board, I can get Nullspine Dragon into play and redraw 9, 12, 16, I don't know, lots of cards. The weirdo in this deck is undisputedly Mind Bomb. This card's ridiculous. It's a single blue sorcery that says everybody takes 3 damage unless they discard up to 3 cards. That's not blue. It hasn't been blue for a long time. Basically, it's a single blue Dragon's Approach, and I'm never going to cut it. As you can tell, I've built a lot of Storm decks, and this one is my favorite by far. It's the perfect Storm deck because 25 of the spells are the same, so it really limits the number of decision trees and really cuts my turns down. It's my favorite to play. It's my favorite to bring to festivals. It's the best. This is an A. Galazeth an A. My next deck is my one and only CEDH deck. This is Winota, Joiner of Forces. I have a beautiful altar by Modfly Altars. I'm obsessed with it. Winota is my one true love. And while I don't play a ton of CEDH, I love playing Winota, and CEDH is where she belongs. So let's look at this deck. It's a little different than most CEDH decks. You'll notice there are 48 creatures in it. And most of them, I think there's 21 humans in this deck at this moment, maybe a little bit more than that. The deck uses hate bears and stacks pieces to slow my opponents down. Let's take a look at these cornerstones. I'm going to move through these cornerstones fairly quick because this is a fairly stock Winota list. The first one is Archon of Emeria. It's a very powerful hate bear in CEDH, as is the second one, Dranith Magistrate. This deck also runs Kiki-Jiki combos with a variety of humans that go infinite and can attack with infinite creatures. The final cornerstone in this deck is Rick, Steadfast Leader, just a random real man on a magic card, but it makes my humans very powerful and can often win just through combat damage without going infinite at all. CEDH decks aren't supposed to come with weirdos, but it is a Rachel deck because I insist that Zerzoth Chaos Rider is good enough for CEDH. I don't know. I like him. I don't play a lot of CEDH. It's not really my thing, but I love playing Winota, and I love playing stacks in CEDH because it makes people really work out a puzzle and try and figure out how to win through this tangled web you've made. So I think Winota is always going to be the CEDH deck I have on hand, and that makes it an A. My next deck is Blex Vexing Pest, but more importantly, Search for Blex. This deck is built around the sorcery on the backside, which is cool because on Archidekt you can lock cards on their backside, so I can actually display Search for Blex as my commander. Other than it being, a mono-black Golgari deck, where I only have black sources in this deck, and yet I do have a couple of hybrid Golgari cards. This deck is a fairly stock reanimator list. It doesn't have any super powerful reanimation targets. All of them are good, but they're not necessarily game ending. I don't run Rograkh. I don't run any infinite combos. It's just big guys that if they stick on the board, I will eventually win the game. Like a reanimator deck, this has a wacky curve, a lot of high stuff on the end, and a lot of low reanimation spells. But let's look at this cornerstones. The first cornerstone in this deck is Abhorrent Overlord. This is scary, but he makes harpies instead. And it's very, very powerful. Anytime I reanimate this, I tend to win the game because I usually have Yara, First of Locthwain in the board. This is a very common 1-2 punch for this deck, which can be a little bit dirtily, even with some of these big top-end creatures. So I like to have those two that work very well together. This is my favorite reanimation spell in the deck. Remember, this is a mono black deck. There's no way to cast life, but death is basically reanimate for 2 mana on the other half of this Golgari card, and it should see more play. I love it. The last one is my favorite reanimation target in the deck. It's Thieving Amalgam, and he's coming for the top of your deck. He's an ape snake, and he's pretty goofy. Wins the game very slowly, and I love him. The weirdo in this deck is Ritual of the Machine. You can sacrifice a creature to gain control of target non-black, non-artifact creature. What? That's not supposed to exist. It's not particularly synergistic in the deck, and it's not particularly good, but it is cool, and I refuse to cut it. Search for Blacks is the culmination of a long search for me to find a mono black deck that I love. I like building mono decks, and I couldn't settle on a mono black deck that was perfect. But Blacks feels silly and fun, and I get to reanimate some really big creatures that take over the game. So I like where the deck has landed, and I really enjoy playing it. Search for Blacks is an A. All right, up next is Dihada, Binder of Wills. If this deck looks familiar, it is because it is very similar to the one that I played on the Dominaria United game nights. I fell in love with Dihada. She's so powerful and really enables some cool creatures to be put into play. So I built it for myself. You can see a lot of legendary creatures, a couple of planeswalkers, a big Bolas Citadel, but mostly creatures. This is an aggressive Mardu deck that's largely white. It's built around haste and recursion and flying and hitting people hard and then doing it again. It's a ton of fun. Let's look at those cornerstones. The first cornerstone of this deck is Goro Goro, Disciple of Ryusei. This card is so underrated and is so powerful. Just being able to give all of your creatures haste at any moment is so good. And he's legendary, so he works perfectly with Dihada. I love him a lot. The next one is Balthor the Defiled. It took a long time for me to get Balthor into this deck. I didn't think of him, honestly. And now that he's in the deck, he's never coming out. He's so good. He's a legendary living death. I love him. Oh my god. The next one is Ao the Dawn Sky. This is exactly the kind of legendary that Dihada loves. It's flying, it's vigilant, it blocks her all day. Plus, when it dies, it does something awesome. I think Ao is great in the deck and really just love having this card in play. The coolest win con in this deck is for sure Heartless Heated Sugu, because Dihada can give him lifelink. And yes, it does damage, and yes, you gain a bunch of life, and yes, it wins games. I love it. And especially when combined with Goro Goro, which gives him haste, this can be so explosive, come out of nowhere, and steal a win. The weirdo in this deck is not a weirdo at all. It's Lingering Souls. Every time people look at this deck, they ask me what Lingering Souls is doing there. And the answer is defending Dihada, making spirits. That's all it needs to do. It's efficient and powerful, and it's good enough in every Planeswalker deck. I love this card. Dihada continues to surprise and excite me. It's exactly how I wanted Mardu to feel. It's aggressive, and it's defensive, and it's resilient, and it hits hard and fast, and I love it. Every time I play Dihada, I find a new cool interaction between legendaries, and it's a blast. I give Dihada an A. Coming up next is Mangara the Diplomat. This is my mono white good stuff deck, and it is a doozy. I built it before mono white had a lot of support in Commander, and I just wanted to sort of prove, I guess, that white was great and you're playing it wrong. And now white has a ton of support in Commander, and this deck is busted. It's so fun to play. It feels very mono white, which is exactly how I wanted it to be. Let's look at those cornerstones. The first cornerstone in this deck is Marshal's Anthem. This is an enchantment with multi-kicker, and when it enters the battlefield, you reanimate the number of creatures for the number of times you've multi-kicked. And in this deck, it's exactly the recursion piece that people do not expect out of a white deck. It brings back huge angels that you're like, oh, we finally dealt with this Sarah's Ascendant or something like that. And now it's back, and it's reanimation in a white deck. It's great for the late game, plus it gives your creatures that little boost. One of my favorite white cards that they've printed recently is Aerial Extortionist. This card is incredible removal. It comes down and basically bounces something, and then every time it connects, which it does a lot, it's a 4/3 flyer, you remove something else. Plus, anytime anybody casts a spell from other than their hand, you draw a card, which is just good. That's from the command zone, or from exile, or a cascade spell, or an adventure. It's really powerful, and it should be in a lot of decks. The next one is just one of the best white cards in Commander of all time. It's Elspeth's Sun's Champion. And I have the beautiful foil from the Secret Lair 30th Anniversary Edition from Rebecca Gay, and it's the best. It board wipes, it makes a huge board. It's just an excellent card in a box. Angel of the Ruins is one of my favorite white cards. I use it a lot. It's just ETB, get rid of 2 huge problems, and then itself is a problem. It's a 5/7 that will hit you, and then be blinked, and exile 2 more problems. It's efficient, and it answers stuff, and it just gets you a plains, puts itself in the graveyard for a Marshal's Anthem. It does it all. The weirdo in this deck is Righteous Aura. This is a great defensive piece that allows you to pay 2 life and a white, and then prevent. It's the next time a source of your choice would deal damage to you this turn, prevent that damage. So you can pay 2 life in exchange for fogging 1 source. And it's such a good rattlesnake that people won't attack you because they know you can prevent the damage. So just having this in play with 1 white up can basically keep people from attacking you with chip damage all the time. Plus, it blanks Voltron decks and Infect decks, and it also hurts like giant burn spells. It does a lot more than you think it would do. And it's one of my favorite white cards. Mangara is one of my favorite decks to play. It's white and it's resilient and it's inevitable and it gains enough life and it reanimates enough creatures and it just keeps coming. Plus, it's a little innocuous because it is mono white. Mangara, you got an S, baby. Next up is a special deck indeed. It's Princess Twilight Sparkle. This is a silver bordered deck that is a pony deck. All kinds of ponies, horses, zebras, Pegasus, unicorns. Every card in this deck has a horse in it or a horse in the art, or it is themed around friendship. Because the deck is called My Little Pony, Magic is Friendship. We've done it. Rock on. A lot of creatures, very low curve. Horses tend to be pretty low CMC. Let's look at those cornerstones to see what is actually going on in this deck. So the deck at its heart is basically a Flyers deck. It takes low CMC Pegasus and just builds them up with counters or whatever overrun I can find. But there is a bit of a Blink sub-theme after Emil the Blessed was printed. So Emil is definitely a cornerstone. The next one is Pegasus Guardian, which also supports that Blink theme. It makes Pegasi anytime a card has left the battlefield this turn. It's a great horse with a powerful Blink ability. This was a very exciting print. The next card is Sacred Mesa. This is an enchantment that makes 1/1 flyer tokens. Yes, it makes you sacrifice a Pegasus every single upkeep, but you can dump a ton of mana to make a lot of flyers, which is very important in this deck. Speaking of a lot of flyers, it's Stormherd, the only win con in this deck. No, there's a couple of overruns, but this is the way that the deck has won the 2 times it has won a Commander game. It's just making a ton of 1/1 flyers. At the end of the day, it is just a flyer deck. The weirdo is Dwarven Pony. He's a little guy, and he gives dwarfs mountain walk. It's so bad. I love him. I won't cut him. He's perfect. Look, this deck is largely an art piece. It's a construction of horse cards that I like, and I keep an eye on arts just to see if a pony shows up in them. They printed a Swords to Plowshares with a horse in it, and it went into this deck. And maybe someday it'll be playable, but these days it's not. Still, it's an S. All right, from ponies to fire, my next deck is Rakdos, Lord of Riots. This is an altar done by Dave Lee. He's Durfington on Twitter. He's done a lot of really sweet altars for me, and I'm obsessed. Rakdos is a high-power combo deck that uses damage to reduce the casting cost of very high CMC colorless creatures. You'll see a lot of creatures that are pingers, a lot of colorless creatures, a lot of stuff that does damage when it enters the battlefield. Wow, look at that. Even split between black and red, basically very high in the 2 and 3 slot. Again, creatures, lands, rock on. This deck is my baby. It's my first deck that I built that felt powerful. Let's check out those cornerstones. The cornerstone of this deck and many Rakdos Lord of Riots deck is Kozilek, Butcher of Truth. 10 mana, 10 colorless mana, which means free! But also it draws cards, which is extremely important in any deck that reduces casting cost of creatures. The next one is my favorite thing to reduce the casting cost of. It's Maga Traitor to Mortals. When this enters the battlefield, Rakdos will reduce the casting cost. So usually I don't pay anything into X. So I play black, black, black. It enters the battlefield, shoots somebody for a whole bunch of life loss, and then makes the next creature I cast even less to cast. It's incredible. One of my favorite Magic cards of all time, Pandemonium, is a cornerstone in this deck. It's Warstorm Surge, but on turn 4. It creates a mess, and I love it. Also, I have a pretty good idea that my creatures are going to be some of the biggest creatures on the battlefield. So Pandemonium is quite strong in this deck. Sanctum of Stone Fangs. This deck is full of little pingers or little things that chip away at life totals on my upkeep, and Sanctum of Stone Fangs is the best one because it drains 3 people and I gain a little bit of life at my upkeep every time. Love Sanctum in this deck. Let's check out that weirdo. He's Plague Spitter. Plague Spitter has been in the deck since the very beginning, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, he deals 1 damage to each creature and each player, and when he's put into the graveyard, he deals 1 damage to each creature and each player. He's just a little damage dealer on your upkeep. He's basically a pinger, but he messes up token bed decks in the meantime. Plus, he's a little cutie. I just love it. This deck is one of my favorites. It's one of my oldest. Rakdos is going to last a lifetime for me. If I'm playing combo decks, if I'm playing damage decks, I want to do it big and do it right. So Rakdos, you're an S. Another oldie but goodie from my collection is Sidisi Brood Tyrant. This is another alter from Dave Lee. It is one of my favorites. Usually if I get a card altered, it's because I've had it for a long time and I love it, and Sidisi is no exception. Look at these numbers. There are 53 commanders, or there are 53 creatures in this deck, and only 3 sorceries, 1 enchantment, and a planeswalker that is often a creature. It is a goofy breakdown here. It is the most rocked on of all of my decks. You can see a little bit of a high curve on creatures, but it's got some decent ramp to support it. Let's look at those cornerstones. Get to know the deck. It is the cornerstone of many a self-mill deck, and also this one. It's Living Death. It's gotta be. This deck wants to load up its graveyard full of creatures and reanimate them onto the battlefield with Living Death, and it does so very, very well. The next cornerstone is Necrotic Ooze. It's a self-mill deck, and many, many of the creatures in the deck have activated abilities. So I love Necrotic Ooze. It turns into this crazy stack of things that gives me so many options and so much flexibility in game. Necrotic Ooze is awesome in this deck. Speaking of cool, Path of Discovery is incredible with Sidisi because you explore. If it's a creature, you can put it into the bin, you make a zombie token with Sidisi, and that explores again. So you can make a huge board of zombies basically instantaneously. And basically, if I'm running a non-creature spell in this deck, it is a banger, and Path of Discovery definitely fits that bill. The last one is Wonder. It finishes so many games with Wonder in the graveyard. You're milling, you're building a huge board, and suddenly your zombies fly. The weirdo in this deck is Heartwood Storyteller. When you have 56 creatures in a deck, you're not going to be casting many non-creature spells. So Heartwood Storyteller says that basically whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, everybody else draws a card. Yeah, that's a little bit of group hug, and it's extremely dangerous, but it's been in the deck for a very long time. And there it will stay. Plus, he's got 2 big, logs. He's got these logs to him. I can't bear to cut him. I won't. Sidisi is one of those decks I've had a lifetime. It has had many iterations. It's had tons of different win cons, and I'm always exploring new veins and the way new creatures that are printed fit into this deck. I love playing it. I love that it's never down for the count. Sidisi, you're an S. My next deck, you know her, you love her. It's Octavia Living Thesis. This is undeniably one of my very favorite decks. It is a mono blue combat deck that uses cantrips and cheap instants to turn evasive creatures into 8/8s and punch hard in the sky. It's got a ton of instants, a very low curve. You will notice that we're largely 1, 2, and 3 drops, very high in the instants and the creatures category as usual. It is also very light on ramp, only 2 pieces of ramp, because a lot of the self-mill is just ramp to get my commander out, and the curve is very low. But let's look at those cornerstones. Shadow Rift is the first card on our list. There is a ton of versions of Shadow Rift in the deck. It gives a creature evasion and it draws a card. Plus it's an instant that triggers Octavia. This card is great and is probably the best iteration of it. The next one is Brain Freeze, but it's not a typical Brain Freeze. This Brain Freeze isn't for your opponents after a long storm turn, it's for milling yourself for about 6. Also, it makes copies, so it can trigger Octavia multiple times and turn multiple things into 8/8s. Brain Freeze is a staple in this deck. The next one is Fairy Mastermind, a new card, but perfect for Octavia. It has flash, it has flying, it draws cards, and it's goofy. I love Fairy Mastermind in this deck and can't wait to turn it into an 8/8. The next one is You Come to a River. I've been really pleased with this card lately. It's interaction. It can bounce a target non-land permanent, and it gives evasion. Plus, it triggers Octavia. So it is a slam dunk in this deck. Let's move on to the weirdo. In this deck, it's gotta be Floodgate. Floodgate is a weird, old, top-down magic card that when it gains flying, dies and deals damage to all of the non-blue, non-flying creatures equal to half the number of islands you control. It's weird, it's powerful, and I have a lot of ways to give it flying. Floodgate it was born for this deck, and this deck was born for Floodgate. I can't cut it. It's way too much fun. Octavia is just exactly what I want out of my blue decks. I want something instant speed. I want something combat-based. I want something a little feisty and silly. She's a dream come true. And of course, Octavia is an S. The final deck in my collection for now, I guess, until I make another episode, is, of course, Feldergriff and Karugga. These two beautiful hippo mamas are individually altered, one of them by Dan Scott, who is the artist of Karugga. This one is done by Amy Weber, who's the artist of Feldergriff. And they're very special to me. I love them so much. And this deck is sort of my masterpiece. It's hard to explain, but basically it wins the game by giving my opponents too many hippos, or alternatively, too many cards, or perhaps giving them a lot of hippos and then stealing them and hitting them with it, or various other options. It's sort of, you just figure it out. Feldergriff is proof that if you draw enough cards and you have enough mana, you can win with a paperclip. You'll notice in this deck there's a ton of interaction, especially free interaction, because it tends to meet the Karugga stipulation. And it's a combo deck, so I do need interaction to protect my very dumb many pieces of a combo. But you'll also see a lot of good stuff cards in here that just make a lot of mana or give you a lot of resources in order to get this goofy thing done. Definitely my weirdest curve on any deck ever. The curve starts at 3, which is what Karugga says. So every card in this deck has a CMC 3 or higher. Let's look at the weirdos that make this deck tick. I mean cornerstones, but also weirdos. The first one is Angel's Trumpet. Definitely a weirdo, definitely beautiful. I have a foiled border one. It's amazing. Angel's Trumpet basically punishes my opponents for the number of creatures that entered the battlefield on their turn. And I can give them a whole lot of them. It also gives all their creatures vigilance, which hopefully doesn't become a problem. Also, if they have a sack outlet, it doesn't work. All right. The deck is bad, but it has good cards in it, like Intruder Alarm, which allow me to give my opponents infinite hippos, because I use Intruder Alarm to tap and untap mana dorks, or things that untap lands. And every time a hippo enters, I untap everything else. You get it. You give them too many hippos, and then you steal all the hippos, and then you kill them with the hippos you've given them. Or you use Selvala. Intruder Alarm will also repeatedly untap Selvala, which could deck your opponents if they have fewer cards in their deck. It could also give you infinite green mana and a whole lot of life. This card is a group hug card, but is extremely dangerous. I've played against Joe Johnson wielding a Selvala a lot, and he's very good with it. So keep an eye out for this little lady. She may look like a group hug card, but it's a lot of value. The final cornerstone is Beck and Call, which has an ability that says, whenever a creature enters the battlefield this turn, you may draw a card. It doesn't have to be under my control. And that's the important thing here. So I can cast Beck and then give an opponent a hippo and draw a card, and 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 a hip. You get it. It's great. I've never cast the Call side. All right. Those are for the 4 cornerstones of the deck. But there is, believe it or not, one card that is weirder than the rest. It's Dingus Staff. Despite having a very funny name, it's actually a win con in this deck. It says whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from play, Dingus Staff deals 2 damage to that creature's controller. Basically, it asks my opponents, why do you have all those hippos? They're going to kill you. And I give them more hippos. It's great. It's the perfect Magic card. When asked what my favorite Magic card is, the real answer is always Dinkus Staff. It's hard to say enough about my Feldergriff deck. It's one of my oldest decks. It's had the most iterations. It's the silliest. And also it has a force of will in it. It's the perfect combination of very powerful cards doing a very stupid thing. And that's sort of what Commander is about for me. So Feldergriff, of course, is an S. I spent a lot of time with my decks when I was making this episode and looking at the statistics and going through Archidekt and trying to figure out what the trends are in my deck. And I did learn a lot about my own deck building style. I obviously love creatures. Even when I'm building Enchantress, the deck has 20 creatures in it. Even when I'm building Spellslinger, the deck has 20 creatures in it. I just love a creature. But also, I found that the decks that tend to be rated highest, the decks that really stick around for me, are the ones that don't play super linearly. They're the kind of decks that I have to figure out how to win with what I have. I don't play a ton of tutors. I don't play a lot of combos. I like to just sort of work with what comes out of my deck. And those are the decks that tend to stick around the longest. So I think when I'm building for me and I'm building for a deck that I want to have longevity, I really tend to just make sure I want the cards to work together rather than have like an explicit win con, one card that tends to win the game, because it's more fun to me to figure it out. It's more fun for me to sort of fight for it. So it's been really interesting going through my decks, and I hope maybe you learned something about your deck building style or mine, or maybe you want to build Feldergriff and Karugo. We need more of them in this world. But thanks for sticking with me. I know it's been a long episode and a lot about my decks. I hope you enjoyed it. To the listeners, what do you think? Did I surprise you with anything? Are there any decks you want to build now? Any hot tech you think I might be missing in my decks? That's my favorite thing to get on my Archidekt or get on my Twitter and send tech to me for my decks. It's my favorite. Do you want to see this episode for other members of the team? Is this the kind of content that you actually like? It's a ton of fun to make, and we're hoping that you guys dig it. If you saw any cards that you got excited about, that you're like, I need a Dingus Staff for my collection right now, go to cardkingdom.com/command and pick one up. They have a great selection of cards in a variety of conditions and printings. We're Commander players. We're very picky about the kinds of cards that go into our deck. And I really like Card Kingdom because they have all of them, and you can go and buy them all in the same place. So I'm not chasing down envelopes and worried about things getting lost in the mail. When it shows up, it's got all of my cards in it. And that makes me feel really safe, and that makes me feel really excited about building a deck because I'm not worried about the logistics of deck building. Again, support the show, buy some cards, go to cardkingdom.com/command. You can also support the show by going to ultrapro.com/command to pick up all of the accessories that you need in your life to protect your growing collection. Get the satin cubes. They're hardy and they fit double sleeved decks in them, plus the tokens. They're huge. So if I have a deck that I am really precious about, like Feldergriff or like Octavia, and I really want to make sure they're safe, I make sure it goes in a satin cube. And you can get all of those at ultrapro.com/command and support the show. We really appreciate everything that you do to make this show possible by using our affiliate codes or by joining our Patreon. We're excited to announce our new partnership with Archidekt. They have a really sweet website. I hope you enjoyed seeing it. I'm still learning and finding new things that you can do on this website. But until next time, I'm going to say thank you to our team here at the Command Zone. We're lucky to have an awesome team of people, including Craig Blanchett, Damon Lentz, Arthur Meadowcroft, Lady Danger, Manson Lung, Josh Murphy, Jake Boss, Jordan Pridgeon, Sam Waldo, Gaurav Galati, Jamie Block, Mitch Trafford, Evan Limburger, Gabriel Pozos, Megan Yip, Eric Lem, Josh Lee Kwai, and Jimmy Wong. Thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you had as much fun as I did. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for your attention. For further inquiries, send an email to commandcast@rocketjump.com or ask us on Twitter at JFWong and at Josh Lee Kwai. See you later, alligator.
Greetings, humans.